Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Grayzone. It's Max Blumenthal here with Aaron Mate, and we have a lot of news as usual. We're hoping to be joined by Ambassador Craig Murray from Beirut in about 45 minutes. Craig is out there reporting in a fairly heavy situation, so I haven't heard from him, so I don't know if he'll be joining us or not, but could be a added bonus, and great to have his perspective, not just from on the ground in Beirut, but on so many issues he's been covering that are relevant to this stream. We're going to cover the U.S. authorizing long-range strikes into Russia by its Ukrainian proxy. We're going to cover Lebanon, as I said. We're going to cover some of the new Trump picks that are coming in, excuse me, and legislation AIPAC is ramming through Congress that some notable progressive representatives are even voting for. But first, we have some massive news. I mean, what seems like unexpected news, something I would have never expected a year and a half or 2 years ago. So, Aaron, maybe you want to explain what just happened at the ICC.
So the news is that the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the now former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity, including using starvation as a weapon of warfare. And, Max, as you indicated, this is a surprise to those of us who have long seen the ICC as a tool of the West. It was known as the International Caucasian Court because it was only after basically African leaders. So this is a huge development, and understandably, the sponsors of Israel's genocide are freaking out already. U.S. politicians, Democrats and Republicans, are vowing to sanction the ICC. There's calls to reinvigorate, Bush's proposal for the Hague Invasion Act, which basically would authorize the U.S. to attack the Hague if it arrested U.S. politicians. And I guess they see, understandably, Israeli leaders like Netanyahu as essentially U.S. citizens as well. And actually, there's a precedent for that because Netanyahu has had U.S. citizenship, which I believe he's given up to be the leader of Israel, but he grew up in the U.S., so he basically is a de facto U.S. citizen, and also just a de facto U.S. citizen because he's carrying out crimes that are sponsored by the U.S. So this is huge.
It's huge, and it is sending tremors through the halls of power in Washington. We can expect a full court press from Washington against the ICC. Here's Lindsey Graham, chief neocon in the Senate, who is declaring that Biden and Trump should actually fear the precedent established by the ICC warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. And he's addressing them and future members of Congress, declaring if we don't act forcefully against the ICC after their outrageous decision to issue arrest warrants for the duly elected Israeli Prime Minister and former Minister of Defense, we're making a huge mistake. And I fear the United States is next. The United States is next. Tony Blinken, Joe Biden, Lloyd Austin, Jake Sullivan could be next. So that's a pretty revealing statement by Lindsey Graham, and also helps explain why the United States and Israel refused to sign on to the ICC. Over something like 150 nations have signed on, which would seem to make it impossible for Netanyahu to travel to those countries. France has stated that it will honor the ICC warrant. But here's another issue, Aaron, which is that the ICC, I think, weakened its credibility by indicting Vladimir Putin over such just such a shallow and superficial and obviously politicized case, which we exposed at the Grayzone as having been driven by the U.S. State Department, by U.S. research, by U.S. prodding. And the researcher himself was in discussions with reporters from the New York Times who wanted it to be over Bucha, which supposedly was the site of a Russian massacre. But instead, Karim Khan, who was essentially installed as the ICC prosecutor by the UK, decided to go after Putin on the basis of evacuating ethnically Russian children, Russian-speaking children, from the war zones in Ukraine's east and in the Donbass and Lugansk. So a very bizarre case. And, the West was told these children were all put in camps. Jeremy Lafredo, our roving reporter, went to one of those supposed camps outside Moscow and found that children from the Donbass were being given free classical music lessons, and they were happy to be there rather than under Ukrainian shelling. And so Vladimir Putin, several months ago, traveled to Mongolia, traveled openly outside of his own sphere of influence, and was received by the Mongolian leadership. Mongolia was actually the subject of a kind of color revolution funded by the National Endowment for Democracy during the 1990s, which was supposed to have turned that country into a Western fiefdom. But we can see that didn't happen, and Putin managed to challenge the ICC warrant Mongolia was an ICC signatory, so we could see Netanyahu doing that himself, but he's accused of much more severe crimes. We can see them playing out day after day. It's a live-streamed genocide. Just 24 hours ago, another school was struck in Gaza City, scores of casualties. It's almost impossible to keep track of how many casualties are taking place. Over 190 journalists assassinated, over 350 footballers in Gaza have been killed. And is FIFA or the European Football Association, are they blocking Israel from participating in football matches and competitions, as they did with Russia immediately after Russia invaded Ukraine? No, they're not doing anything. They're welcoming bands of hooligans escorted by Mossad agents into European cities to attack their citizens and then claim that they're victims of a pogrom. So international institutions have allowed this genocide to proceed. They have debased themselves by responding to the orders of the United States, which acts unilaterally and refuses to sign on to these multilateral institutions. And now finally, they've stepped up following a long pressure campaign, which we can discuss. But how will they enforce this? How could this possibly be enforced?
It's true that you know what? Let me just close the window because I'm getting a lot of street noise. I'll be right.
Yeah, well, the sounds of Brooklyn, as the sounds of Brooklyn filter through Aaron's window, the shrill howls of Lindsey Graham can be heard just outside my own, as he fears becoming Netanyahu's cellmate.
Just on the point about the ICC warrant against Putin. Yeah, as we exposed at the Grayzone, it was a really thin gruel. It was based, as you talked about, largely on State Department produced or abetted reports. And again, not on the issue of research. Yeah. Not on the issue of like Bucha or, like alleged war crimes in terms of killing people, but in the evacuation of children. But it does put the U.S. in a really bad position because, of course, the U.S., when the ICC indicted Putin, loved it and called on everybody to help the ICC and did directly cooperate with the ICC in that indictment. So all of a sudden, the ICC is wonderful when it indicts Putin, but now when it indicts Netanyahu for far more serious crimes, far more serious, now all of a sudden the Biden administration is in a bad position. They're also in a bad position because they're openly taking credit for Israel's genocide. Jake Sullivan just gave an interview where he was asked like about the U.S. role in Gaza, and listen to him brag about what the U.S. did.
Let me ask a question about legacy. Are you concerned that one of your legacies will be facilitating the way Israel has fought in Gaza that has killed tens of thousands of women and children?
The U.S. has taken a very clear position since this war began. Israel had a right to defend itself after the worst slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. The U.S. also, over the course of the past year, has made a massive difference in terms of whether there would be widespread famine in Gaza or not widespread famine, in terms of working with the Israelis to try to minimize civilian harm over the course of the months of the conflict.
So he's taking credit because in his view, there wasn't widespread famine, even though actually there have been warnings of famine for a long time now. And in some parts of Gaza, there is famine. But he's saying because it wasn't in every single corner of Gaza, he should take credit for that. And then he says we also played a major role in minimizing civilian harm. What is he talking about when tens of thousands of people have been murdered, along with many more wounded and had their lives destroyed? And of course, well over 1 million displaced. That counts as civilian harm as well. But he's openly taking credit. And so, you wonder if Netanyahu and Gallant are liable for war crimes, why isn't the administration that is taking credit for the same actions, why aren't they liable as well?
Real shocker that undead vampire is not the best person to save lives. Since 2014, when the ICC prosecutor at the time, Fatou Bensouda, began investigating Israel for war crimes during Operation Protective Edge, which left about 2,300 people dead, most of them women and children, in the Gaza Strip, destroyed 100,000 homes and structures. A punishing assault that's been sort of forgotten in light of the full wholesale destruction of Gaza during well, I don't even know what the operation is called. Cross Swords. I mean, it's Operation Einsatzgruppen reenactment. I don't know what they're calling it, but sort of been forgotten. But Bensouda, who is Karim Khan's predecessor as ICC prosecutor, came under not just attack, but threats of blackmail and the destruction of her personal life by Mossad director Yossi Cohen. And this was revealed in mainstream media. I mean, this is The Guardian, revealed Israeli spy chief threatened ICC prosecutor over war crimes inquiry. Former head of the Mossad allegedly threatened a chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in a series of secret meetings in which he tried to pressure her into abandoning a war crimes investigation. Yossi Cohen's covert contacts with the ICC's then prosecutor, Bensouda, took place in the years leading up to her decision to open a formal investigation into alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in the occupied Palestinian territories. And that investigation is what flowed into Karim Khan's announcement that he was seeking an arrest warrant for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. So in light of that, Israel continues to press the attack on the ICC, and it does so through hacking, through spying, through trying to destroy the life of Karim Khan. I mean, which I think is one reason why it took how many months did it take for this warrant to finally be authorized by the ICC's judges? Because the judges know they will be next in the crosshairs, not just of Israel and the United States. Spying, hacking, intimidation. This is a joint investigation between The Guardian and 972, the Israeli sort of left publication. Israel's 9-year war on the ICC exposed. And this describes the hacking of Khan's emails, personal attacks, spying on him constantly. And it sort of culminated with what was going to be obvious, because the Mossad specializes in sexual blackmail. That's what they love to nail people on. And Karim Khan supposedly had some allegation sitting around. Actually, Israel was struggling to find something that would work with Khan. This was what they were trying to do to prevent the ICC warrant from moving, was trying to find some sexual blackmail on him. And it was reported that Israeli intelligence closely followed Khan's visit to the Rafah crossing of Gaza, as well as the West Bank in southern Israel, to try to understand what materials the Palestinians were giving him. And one Israeli source said, Khan is the most boring man to gather intelligence about in the world because he's straight as a ruler. But eventually, they found this. International court prosecutor who charged Netanyahu faces sexual misconduct accusation. And I guess it ultimately didn't intimidate him, because the warrant has finally dropped. But we're going to see, I mean, we've seen Mike Waltz, former Cheney staffer who is coming in as Donald Trump's national security advisor, threatened that in January, everything's going to change for the ICC. If Biden doesn't do it, they're going to sanction the ICC judges. They're going to strip their visas, and they're going to target them. And actually, that's what Mike Pompeo did as Secretary of State to Fatou Bensouda and her staff. So the U.S., I think the point here is the United States is willing to destroy the entire rules-based order that it helped build up after World War II in the name of preserving Zionism and protecting its genocidal imperatives in Palestine. I think that's the takeaway.
Well, that's the point, is the rules-based order, as the Biden administration calls it, doesn't include international law. It doesn't include international institutions. It only includes them insofar as they serve U.S. interests. So when Khan is fast-tracking the indictment of Vladimir Putin, unlike what he did with Netanyahu, where he slow-walked it, that's part of the rules-based order. Now, all of a sudden, the ICC, for defying the Godfather, now they're outside of it, and they will be destroyed. And the mask is certainly off, and there will be a contrast here between the U.S. and other, NATO states. As you mentioned, France has said they'll respect the ICC, and I think other countries will follow suit, because there's only so much, naked contempt for international law that people will be comfortable with. Obviously, they were comfortable with it in letting Israel commit genocide in Gaza, but people are supposed to have respect for institutions like the ICC and take that seriously. And this will expose again just how much of a rogue state both the U.S. and Israel are in standing alone. And it, but it is unfortunate this took so long. I understand he was under a lot of pressure, and there was he certainly was under personal threats and coercion attempts. So I think that explains why this took him so long. But of course, this indictment, if there was justice, would have come out the day of Israel beginning its assault on Gaza, because already by then it was illegally occupying Gaza. Yep. And already within the first day, Israeli leaders were vowing to cut off food and fuel and medicine. I mean, Yoav Gallant said it openly. Netanyahu said it openly.
Yeah,
so
I mean, leading Netanyahu allies in the Knesset, Ariel Kalner, calling for Nakba 2.0. I mean, they were calling for genocide from the beginning.
Yeah.
Netanyahu is on the run. It is sort of unprecedented to see him like this, not just from an arrest warrant, but Sarah Netanyahu required that an Israeli F-35 escort his El Al plane back to Tel Aviv for flight. He's not traveling much these days. He's not seen in public very often. He fears attempts on his life because he has authorized the assassination of so many officials, and he's put a target on his own back. He's basically bunkered. His own bedroom was struck by a Hezbollah drone at his mansion in Caesarea on the coast of Israel. So, and he is a singular force in Israeli leadership who also faces prosecutions from his own government, from the Israeli judiciary if he leaves office. So we're nearing the end of a terrible decades-long saga that began with Netanyahu coming to the United States, shortening his name to Benjamin Netanyahu to help the American public get to know him better, and which could end up with a very ignominious end. And I think the war, the quagmire that Netanyahu has found himself in Gaza and Lebanon, is tied to his own personal fate, which is why the war continues. And on the theme of the United States shredding the rules-based international order, or making a mockery of that phrase, or perhaps we could say weaponizing it against the real international order, the United States just vetoed a Security Council draft resolution at the UN that would have demanded an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza and the release of all hostages under obvious orders from Netanyahu and the Israeli regime. And we've seen this image so many times of an American representative holding the lonely hand of shame aloft on the Security Council at the United Nations to extend the genocide in Gaza, the war in Lebanon, the escalation across the region, all on behalf of the Israeli regime. And it's always a Black person that's doing it, which is just so sad and speaks to the demise of liberalism that's taking place in the United States as it's reduced to empty, hypocritical symbols. So I don't know what else there is. What else there is to say here? The United States Senate just blocked a bill by Bernie Sanders that would have penalized the Pentagon for missing its 7th audit in a row with $1 trillion missing. It looks like the Senate will shoot down Bernie Sanders' bill to block offensive weapons to Israel because they're controlled by AIPAC. We're looking at a morally depraved government in the United States that is almost alone in the world, except with its vassals in the West who are increasingly turning against it, all because of a tiny little apartheid state 6,000 or 7,000 miles away.
I think this is the 4th or 5th time that the U.S. has vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire, and that's a part of dozens of times, nearly 50 times, that the U.S. has vetoed a UN Security Council measure, that's critical of Israel. So this is just the U.S. playing its traditional role of protecting Israeli aggression at the world's highest forum. And the thing about the Senate vote, 19 senators total, including Bernie Sanders, voted to suspend these arms transfers, which I believe is a record in the Senate. That's a record. And of course, the Biden administration was, viciously or intensively lobbying Democrats not to vote for this. Biden officials accused basically Bernie of supporting Hamas by voting for this, but Bernie did get 18 other people, which is a record. But then the question becomes, where were these people before? Why are they only doing this now? I mean, John Ossoff of Georgia gave a great speech on the Senate floor, but where were you before? These same people,
Jewish Senator John
Jewish
Ossoff.
Senator, yeah. I mean, it's great to see now, but way too late. These people, most of these people, including Chris Van Hollen, they've all voted for previous arms transfers from the U.S. to Israel.
Yeah, Chris Van Hollen really puzzles me. I think he gave the best speech. It was clear he was really participating in this measure, that he was into it, that he was fluent in the subject matter, that he was indignant, but he's been raising the alarm about Israeli atrocities from the Senate floor as a senator from Maryland, with a heavy constituency of AIPAC members in suburban DC and Baltimore, who have supported him and donated to him. And every time after he gives one of these speeches, these jeremiads against Israeli atrocities, he turns around and votes for more military aid to Israel. So this is the first time he's taken actually a material step back, and it's taken over a year for these clowns to do this. Bernie Sanders himself was opposed to a ceasefire for over 6 months, 7 months.
Yeah.
What did they all have, like a limit? They'd like go to some whiteboard in their office and draw up a random arbitrary number of children that can be killed by Israel and then wait till it crosses that threshold. I mean, what do they do to decide that they'll finally put their foot down?
One of Chris Van Hollen's excuses was the fact that the money for arming Israel was also packaged in with money for arming Ukraine.
Yeah.
And Chris Van Hollen said, I couldn't possibly vote against arming Ukraine. So great job to progressives for, getting behind the Ukraine proxy war and therefore giving people an excuse to also arm Israel, because Biden correctly saw these two proxy wars, or like these two disasters, as interlinked, because both of them are there to advance U.S. hegemony. That's why the U.S. is arming both Israel and Ukraine. But he can't. In this case, he lost that excuse and finally took a vote, rarely against Israel. But to answer your question, I think it was. I mean, it's obvious. AIPAC. He didn't want to have AIPAC coming after him. AIPAC is just bragging about how like 96% of the races that they got involved in were successes for AIPAC, and so and they can point to the ousting of Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman to anybody who's considering falling out of line. But 19 senators, that's a record. That is a step forward, although a very tiny one. But it is something that record number of senators, all Democrats, not a single Republican could bring themselves to vote for this. Not even Rand Paul, who's supposed to be the anti-war libertarian, but can never remember his anti-war libertarian beliefs when it comes to arming Israel. Not even Rand Paul could vote for this on the Republican side.
I didn't know that. That's truly pathetic.
Yeah. That
John Ossoff could do it, representing Atlanta, and Rand Paul can't do it. I remember Rand Paul actually early on when he was running for Senate, he said, we need to look at military aid to Israel and reducing it. Next thing you know, he's on a trip to Israel, funded by AIPAC.
Yeah. If you talk to his staffers, the people around him, they know exactly what's up. They're very aware of what's happening, but just when it comes time to vote, doesn't matter.
They're probably watching.
Yeah.
Shout out to Rand Paul staffers carrying the spirit of Ron Paul, who will, he's got to be shaking his head at home. And Jamal Bowman, after being defeated, I saw him say that he offered to go to Michigan to like save the day for Kamala Harris. That's pretty pathetic, like a total lack of dignity. The party went against you. They didn't defend you against AIPAC. They wanted you out. The whole party wanted you out, and you're going to go campaign for them. And do they really want you like slamming a chair on stage and engaging in those kind of antics? I don't think so. But they sent Richie Torres, who is owned by AIPAC, to campaign in Michigan. Let's not forget how they lost. But Aaron, you brought up the U.S. arming, increasing aid to Israel and Ukraine simultaneously. And we saw one of the most fateful decisions so far in the proxy war and in the Biden administration, in the entire Biden administration, as Biden was in the Amazon jungle and kind of like walking off. He like walks off into the jungle here. He made the decision to authorize the use of ATACMS missiles by Ukraine deep inside Russian territory. Why was this decision made at this juncture, and what will be the ramifications? Will it actually change the shape of the battlefield?
Well, in terms of why this was decided now, I mean, my best answer is that Donald Trump was elected and the Biden team lost. And so they're going out anyway. And this is their pet project. Biden views the
Yep.
Ukraine proxy war as a signature foreign policy achievement. So whether this is a combination of just desperately trying to prolong this war for as long as possible, or just spite, just like trying to show everyone that like Biden's going to do everything he can to escalate a war that many voters rejected. I mean, Trump, whatever his actual plans are, did say he would end this war very quickly, within 24 hours. So Biden on his way out the door is just trying to authorize one last escalation, even though just recently, before the election, this is late September, the Biden administration, on purpose leaked U.S. intelligence saying that long-range strikes into Ukraine with U.S. weapons were a mistake. This is from the New York Times in late September. U.S. intelligence agencies concluded that granting Ukraine's request to use Western missiles against targets deep in Russia could prompt forceful retaliation while not fundamentally changing the course of the war. That was what was happening in late September when Biden, after receiving these warnings, backed down. But now that the election is over, and Biden, I guess, feels like he has nothing left to lose. He's nearing the end of his life anyway, so who cares what happens to the rest of us, who he's leaving behind. He's decided to reverse course and allow these strikes that his own intelligence officials told him won't make a difference to the war and will force a Russian retaliation, which is exactly what has just happened, with Russia launching a very sophisticated weapon at Ukraine. Ukraine says it's an ICBM, which would be unprecedented if it actually is. It's not confirmed yet, though. I'm not actually, it's as we're broadcasting, the nature of the weapon is not confirmed. But whatever it was a very powerful missile. Whether it was an ICBM or something else, it's not confirmed yet. But Russia
it's
has
a message to the West.
It's a message, exactly. And apparently this missile is something that could, if Russia wanted to, carry nuclear weapons. And that is what Russia has done, is sent this message to the West by attacking Dnipro with this. And just yesterday and the day before, basically the Biden administration was shrugging off Russia's potential response. The fact that Russia lowered its threshold for using nuclear weapons, the fact that Russia was promising to respond at the launching of U.S. weapons into Russian territory, which we have to stress requires U.S. participation, because Ukraine can't use these ATACMS missiles on its own. There has to be U.S. support for that. So Russia made a warning, and now they've given the response.
Here's Vladimir Putin on the response. Response to the use of American and British long-range weapons. On November 21st of this year, the Russian armed forces made a combined strike on one of the objects of the defense industrial complex of Ukraine. In combat conditions, was also carried out the testing of one of the latest Russian missile systems of medium range. In this case, with ballistic missile and nuclear-free hypersonic equipment.
So this comes after, the U.S. has led the way in shrugging off fears of an escalation. If you read every single report in the establishment newspapers talking about why Biden has decided to take one more step up the escalation ladder, they always say it's because Putin hasn't forcefully responded in ways that we feared. So why not? And so here's now Putin saying this is our response with a hypersonic missile. And, I don't know exactly the category of missile here, but he mentions their medium range missiles. So I wonder if that is a missile that was previously banned under the INF treaty, which the U.S. pulled out of under Donald Trump. Yeah. No one raised a stir about it because that was back when Democrats were obsessed with fantasizing that Trump was a Russian agent. And so no one cared that Trump killed one of the most important nuclear arms control treaties with Russia. So I wonder if this missile that Russia just fired is a direct result of the Russiagate mania, which didn't care about a really important piece of arms control being killed because it was more important to believe that Trump and Putin were really in cahoots.
Here's Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin on calling Putin's bluff.
We've known for several weeks that they were revamping their policy on use of nuclear weapons. As I look at what they're doing, and we watch their strategic forces, very carefully. I don't see a change in their strategic force posture, and so we'll continue to remain vigilant in this regard. But At this point, no, I don't see an indication that there's an imminent intent to use nuclear weapons.
Don't you? Isn't that reassuring?
Sure inspires confidence. Yeah, we'll continue to remain vigilant as Russia launches a hypersonic missile into Ukraine. And again, and this is the whole point. Like, personally, am I concerned about nuclear war? I mean, if I were betting, no, I wouldn't bet it. But the point is, why continue to risk it? And also, whatever the U.S. does here in authorizing these escalations, it's Ukraine that will pay the price. You know, Russia, if it wanted to, it could now escalate its steps, even its targets even further. So this was a military site in Dnipro. But what could come next if this keeps happening? If these long range strikes with U.S. assistance and support keep happening, what is Russia going to target next with this incredibly powerful and dangerous weapon? And the Biden administration's whole thing is letting Ukraine pay the price of its own reckless escalation.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't gone beyond the borders of Ukraine. And so what does the Biden administration care about Slavic lives or Slavic infrastructure? I mean, for all they care, the infrastructure will be destroyed, and then new infrastructure will be built and leveraged by BlackRock, the true owners of Ukraine, which effectively represent U.S. capital. That's kind of the point. And we're not there. We're forcing all these vassal states and their stupid bought off leadership in Sweden and Finland, along with the Baltic states, to join NATO, and they will be next. And here's what Swedes are being told: what to do if nuclear war comes. Hoard food and ignore propaganda. This is from the Times of London. Ignore that propaganda warning you that right now that's warning you that this might be insane and that joining NATO might have got your PM a standing ovation from Biden at the State of the Union, but it's going to get the rest of you killed. And I mean, and alcohol costs so much in Sweden, like you can't really like just get drunk from now until the apocalypse without just paying tons and tons of money. I mean, you have to like sneak across the border to Denmark to even like drink away the pain of knowing that you're now in NATO. Sweden's government has updated its emergency advice to citizens as global tensions rise, telling them that the country will never surrender. We will never surrender until nuclear hellfire pours down on our once Viking realm. I mean, what is wrong with these? I mean, don't they see what they're marching into? And this is after we saw Ursula von der Leyen visit. I think she visited Finland and visited a bunker and said all of Europe needs to bunker down and prepare like Finland is. As more and more European countries, including the UK, are talking about full conscription for their men. We can see Europe marching under US orders into oblivion. I mean, Aaron, I think you said this really shows that the entire war is a US project.
Oh, 100%. But the fact that Britain immediately follows the US decision to let Ukraine use ATACMS by letting Ukraine use the British Storm Shadows, it shows that everybody waits for the Godfather to give his blessing and then they follow suit. That's exactly what is happening. And on this issue of, NATO and Finland and Sweden and how we're supposed to all think this is some achievement. If you listen to Joe Biden, back during that brief moment when he was still fighting to remain the nominee, he kept pointing to the fact that I'm the guy that stood up to Putin. I'm the guy that expanded NATO. So he really sees the fact that Finland and Sweden have been admitted into NATO as some sort of achievement that we're supposed to be impressed by. When really all it did, as you pointed out, is make everything a lot more dangerous, especially for the people of Sweden and especially Finland, because it's right there on Russia's border. But how has this helped anyone except for defense contractors? No one's yet to explain that.
Defense contractors, and Lloyd Austin was a Raytheon board member. ATACMS are manufactured, I believe, by Lockheed Martin. And former Trump Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan was on Lockheed Martin's board. I don't know where Pete Hegseth stands on this, but a who's who of Biden and Trump officials have walked through that revolving door and stand to benefit. And it's just so reassuring to hear them calling Putin's bluff when they accused Putin constantly of lying whenever there was an attempt at negotiation. They basically denied that negotiations were even real. And now we know that they were on the table. It's a fact. And, you know, we had Angela Merkel's admission about a year and a half, 2 years ago, that the Minsk Accords were simply a ruse in order to allow Ukraine to arm up and be NATOized to prepare for the inevitable direct confrontation with Russia. Now Francois Hollande has been pranked by Vovan and Lexus, the Russian pranksters. I don't have the video in front of me. He admitted the same thing.
Yeah.
The Minsk Accords were just a joke. The West used them in order to buy time for Ukraine. And now it's time. We're almost at midnight on the doomsday clock. And we, you know, I don't know if there's anything.
Well, the critical thing I think the critical thing now to ask is, if there are negotiations, you know, say Trump falls through on his plan to end the war, what is Russia going to accept at this point?
Yeah.
After all these years of Western officials openly admitting that they never intended to implement the Minsk Accords, after the Biden administration basically laughed off Russia's proposals in late 2021 to avoid an invasion, after the West intervened to block the Istanbul peace accord that was reached between Russia and Ukraine, where the central demand of Russia was simply that Ukraine commit to neutrality, as is enshrined in its founding state declaration of sovereignty, which is not a radical demand. After all that, what is Russia going to agree to at this point?
Yeah.
Back in Istanbul, Russia was fine with Ukraine joining the European Union, which undermined, by the way, this whole talking point that Russia has been trying to block Ukraine joining the West. That was never actually an issue. The issue was the fact that Russia wanted guarantees that Ukraine would not join NATO, a hostile military alliance. But at this point now, after all these cynical games, after all the duplicity, after the blocking of diplomacy, what is Russia going to actually accept at this point? Will they, I mean, they're definitely going to be holding on to Ukrainian territory that they've taken. I mean, that's clear, which Ukraine could have avoided had they had they accepted their own peace deal back in April 2022 in Istanbul. But will Russia even be amenable to Ukraine joining the EU? Given all this, given the fact that you know, Western states are not directly participating in military attacks on Russian territory with Western weapons, the ATACMS of the Storm Shadows, I doubt it. So all this has just made, on top of all the dangers it's fueling, a long-term diplomatic solution that can be, you know, that can resolve everyone's concerns and be acceptable to everyone. It's that much less likely.
Well, I mean, maybe you could address this move, which I think is sort of the final U.S. card on the table before negotiations, and how it could actually twist Russia's arm. I don't think that I don't think that Ukraine is capable of ever retaining escalation dominance here. It's never going to happen. I mean, Jake Sullivan admitted it. U.S. states that Ukraine needs military mobilization more than new weapons. And we saw Lindsey Graham actually go to Kiev, or Kyiv, to be politically correct, and demand that they lower the conscription age to 16. This was complemented by, I think, a Vogue magazine cover showing Ukrainian teenagers galloping through a military base in military uniforms as the sort of flower of Ukraine is shoveled glamorously into the slaughterhouse of U.S. empire. There just aren't enough bodies to complement all the fancy weapons and gadgets and electronic warfare devices that they're being gifted by U.S. taxpayers. Actually, a lot of them are sort of recycled from like the first Gulf War, so they're not even that high quality. There isn't much to negotiate with when there actually is, probably in Turkey or somewhere like that, a real negotiating session between Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah. Yeah, they've already gotten Ukraine to lower the conscription age to 25 from 27, but that's not enough for these proxy warriors. Now, Jake Sullivan is openly saying, just as Lindsey Graham did, that you should make the conscription age even lower, presumably to 18, which is what Lindsey Graham wants. So that's all they have. It's just telling more Ukrainians to sacrifice themselves. That's all they can do at this point. And also, another desperate measure is, but the Biden administration is sending anti-personnel landmines, which they previously said they would never do because that was a Trump administration move to allow them, to allow their use globally. And the Biden administration vowed it would never do that. But they're so desperate as Russia advances that now they're sending these indiscriminate weapons, which will, of course, maim civilians, just as the cluster munitions that they also fast-tracked to Ukraine maim civilians as well. So that's all they have, is just pushing out all the money they have out the door, as Blinken and Sullivan have promised, letting Ukraine hit Russia with U.S. weapons. And by the way, what did they say when they authorized the ATACMS? They said this will only be used against Russian and North Korean troops in Kursk, right, where Ukraine's launched this incursion in Russian territory. So first of all, the first Ukrainian ATACMS strike did not hit Kursk. It was in a different region. So that claim is shown to be a lie. And then there's the fact that where's the proof that North Korean troops are even in Kursk? The U.S. says this. Ukraine says this as well, but there's no evidence to back it up. There are North Korean troops inside Russia training with Russian troops, which they have done for years. But the evidence for North Korean forces fighting alongside Russian forces, it's non-existent. So we have an escalation coupled with what looks like just another fabrication, to justify U.S. militarism, which is just the playbook. So that's how we're seeing the Biden administration spend its last 2 months in office.
And that will be Biden's legacy, along with piles and piles of dead bodies and destroyed homes in Gaza. We are about to be joined by Ambassador Craig Murray live from Beirut. Craig, give me a thumbs up or a hand up if you're ready to join us, if you can hear us. Great. All right, so without any need for much introduction, Ambassador Craig Murray from Beirut, who's now a credentialed reporter on the ground there and is a prolific reporter on British and U.S. intelligence intrigues, war, and a whistleblower who blew the whistle on the British torture program while ambassador to Uzbekistan. Craig, welcome to the Grayzone. And we hope your internet is adequate. The worst internet I ever had in my life was in Beirut. We cannot hear you very well.
Cutting out there for a moment.
Yeah. Well, welcome, Craig.
Can you hear me okay now?
Craig, it looks like we don't have a good connection with you, but we'll try to see if it improves. But yeah, you definitely are cutting out.
Okay, well, Craig, just let's see if we can make this work. You were just reporting from central Beirut after the assassination of Hezbollah's media relations director, Mohammed Afif, which kind of shows how desperate Israel's getting for targets. There have been constant strikes on southern Beirut. What have you been seeing since you arrived in Beirut?
So he's going to try to change his connection. So we'll come back to Craig very shortly. He'll be back with us very shortly. Yeah, as he tries to fix his connection. And let me, as we're waiting for Craig, there's some breaking news, which is that Matt Gaetz has withdrawn his nomination for Attorney General. So that's one Trump pick already down, and we'll see who else gets thrown out too. But that's not surprising. This was always a pretty far-fetched nominee. The ultimate middle finger to the establishment. And Matt Gaetz, just as revelations are coming out about his alleged payments to women for sex, and there's a house ethics report about him that like the contents of which are already being leaked. I think basically preemptively he's dropping out to avoid all that scrutiny. What I think motivated establishment Washington against Gaetz is not his whatever's going on in his personal life. It's the fact that he did hold some genuine anti-establishment views. He called, for example, pardoning Edward Snowden, which you're not allowed to do in Washington, especially if you want to be the attorney general. But anyway, just as we saw with people like Mike Flynn, that's one Trump nominee, Trump selection, who's now already out of the way pretty quickly, a lot quicker than they got Mike Flynn, which it took a couple of months.
Gaetz, would have been the gates of hell opening for the Beltway establishment had he somehow gotten in there. I would have been shocked if he had made it through his confirmation hearings. And sounds like he, opened himself up and left himself fairly compromised. But obviously, what did they really hate about him? They hated that he was a critic of the national security state. They hated that he challenged the U.S. emergency rule, the emergency declarations that have enabled U.S. wars around the globe, that he has actually challenged Silicon Valley cartels with anti-monopoly legislation, that he's worked with Lena Khan at the FTC. He's done things that you don't expect from a Republican, that many Democrats actually opposed. So I think that's what this really comes down to. And there, if someone gets through as Trump's Department of Justice pick, it will be more in line with Jeff Sessions. Someone like very acceptable to the establishment. We're hearing them praise Marco Rubio constantly as his Secretary of State pick from, Democratic senators and liberal publications. They're completely fine with Marco Rubio. Craig, if you think your internet is functional now, give me a thumbs up. We'll try again. Again, Lebanon has just the worst internet imaginable. I don't know if you can hear me. Or
it's not looking too promising, but should we just try and bring him back in?
He's trying again.
Okay.
I blame the Mossad for this.
Me too.
That's why I haven't really tried to bring a guest on from Beirut or from Gaza, is just because the internet connections are so touchy.
Yeah.
I had this thing when I was in Beirut called the Wise Box, and it was like this giant hotspot that you'd have to bring around. And it was like dial-up speed, but otherwise there just simply was no internet.
Yeah, amazingly, when I was there last, I'd been to Damascus first, to Syria. And even though Syria had gone through a decade-long dirty war, the internet there was way better than it was in neighboring Lebanon, which is in Beirut, which is just like 45 minutes away. But yes, I totally blame the Mossad as well. And just, the elite of that country, which has pillaged the state.
Yeah,
deprived it of vital infrastructure, people have to get generators. And so anyway, that's what we're seeing now with Craig's internet, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And also the routine Israeli bombings of Lebanon with U.S. support also don't help.
It doesn't help. We can continue on Trump's picks, since we were talking about Mike Rogers, if you want. There's the Tulsi Gabbard is still in the running for DNI, and she's being accused of being a Russian asset by Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who's doubled down. And this is Tulsi Gabbard, someone who's been in the U.S. military for how long? Like 2 decades?
Yep. And that doesn't stop people like Debbie Wasserman Schultz from saying things like this.
And just finally, I mean, I know you did say that Tulsi Gabbard is likely a Russian asset, and you received backlash for that. What's your response to that?
You know, just look. I'm not the only one that said that or questioned her alliance with the United States and our interests. I mean, she's a Russian sympathizer. She is someone who has.
Do you think she could be trusted with the nation's secrets? If I may cut in, do you think?
I do not. I do not think that she's someone who can be trusted with the nation's secrets, and I don't think our Five Eyes allies and our allies around the world will trust her with theirs. And that is what will really put America in a very difficult national security situation when we don't have the full trust of our allies that we work with, she's going to put intelligence agents out across the globe, or maybe she won't. Maybe she, because she sympathizes with some of our enemies, will decide not to make sure that we can have real windows of intelligence into what's going on there and make us and put us further in jeopardy. It's unacceptable.
So the question that should have been asked of her, if there were real journalists or interviewers who weren't actually in line with this kind of neocon thinking, is if Tulsi Gabbard is actually a Russian agent or has some covert ties to Russia, why hasn't she been investigated by the U.S. Army? And if she hasn't been investigated by the U.S. Army, then are you accusing the U.S. Army of deliberately harboring Russian agents, as Joseph McCarthy and Roy Cohn did when they basically brought the U.S. Army before the House Un-American Affairs Committee? Because that sounds like what you're doing. And you can tell she kind of modulated her language from Russian asset to Russian sympathizer. And everybody's a Russian sympathizer now. If you want any negotiations with Russia to, for example, ink new missile treaties to bring back the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, for example, to negotiate an end to the Ukrainian proxy war, which polls now show a majority of Ukrainians want. A new Gallup poll shows a majority of Ukrainians want an immediate ceasefire. But not Debbie Wasserman Schultz and the Democrats, who are basically just providing human or megaphones for the national security state. There's that poll from Gallup. And look at the numbers.
Look at all these Russian sympathizers in Ukraine. Yeah. And of course, you know, this has been a majority position inside Ukraine for a very, very long time, until the Maidan coup of 2014, when now all of a sudden you had millions of Ukrainians no longer being under Ukrainian control because they rebelled against the coup. But like for a long time, the majority of Ukrainians, they supported the Minsk Accords. They supported neutrality. Like back when George W. Bush pushed through this promise of NATO membership to Ukraine in 2008, like only a small percentage of Ukrainians wanted NATO membership. So this number now is totally in line with what Ukrainian public opinion has long been. And amazingly, it doesn't even include those areas of the Donbass and other parts of eastern Ukraine that aren't even under Ukrainian control. So this just shows how Ukrainians are far more pro-peace than their so-called American allies. And, you know, another irony of Debbie Wasserman Schultz accusing someone of being a foreign asset is how much money does she take from AIPAC? She's a literal Israeli asset.
Yeah.
Like, and she fantasizes about Tulsi Gabbard being paid by Russia. She's literally paid for her political career by an asset of the Israeli government, AIPAC, and other pro-Israel lobby groups. So this is not only just, you know, a neo-McCarthyism, it's also projection.
Well, she said she can say that she's a Russian asset because everybody's saying it, just like she can be owned by Israel because everybody's owned by Israel in Congress.
Yeah. Here's one more. Let's hear what Nikki Haley had to say, because Nikki Haley is a former, you know, member of Trump's administration in his first term. She was the ambassador to the UN. And funnily enough, Trump made a big show of saying that Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo won't be invited back to his administration. Nikki Haley then said that she actually was invited back, but she declined the job. And now she's weighing in on Trump's selection of Tulsi Gabbard.
Said that Donald Trump turned the U.S. into Saudi Arabia's prostitute. head of our national intelligence. In Congress, Tulsi criticized Trump's authoritarian strike against Qasem Soleimani. Now, I will remind you, he was considered the master of death in Iran. She said he had no justification whatsoever for killing him. She tried to limit Trump's war powers against Iran. She tried to cut our annual defense budget so that we couldn't punish Iran and hinder their influence. Reminder, Iran is our #1 sponsor of terrorism.
Gabbard
was defending Iran. She went to Syria in 2017 for a photo op with Bashar al-Assad while he was massacring his own people. She said she was skeptical that he was behind the chemical weapons attacks. Now, this to me is disgusting because, Cheney, you and I were at the United Nations when Assad did those chemical attacks on those children. Yep. And you can go back and look at a speech I gave holding up pictures of dead children who had been killed by chemical attacks. For her to say that Assad was not behind that, literally everything she said about that were Russian talking points. Every bit of that. That was Russian propaganda. After Russia invaded Ukraine, Tulsi Gabbard literally blamed NATO. Our Western alliance is responsible for countering Russia. She blamed NATO for the attack on Ukraine. And the Russians and the Chinese echoed her talking points and her interviews on Russian and Chinese television. Tulsi Gabbard pushed for dropping charges against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange and pardoning National Security Agency contractor Edward Snowden, both whom were accused of leaking highly sensitive U.S. secrets that put Americans in danger. She called for Trump to end
Okay, we can cut it.
War.
Anyway, what a ringing endorsement.
That was like, that was like Clockwork Orange torture for me. Who the hell listens to her podcast, or should I call it her Zogcast? Nikki Haley Live. Like, who listens to that? But that was a great ad for Tulsi Gabbard from Nikki Haley.
Yeah. I mean, again, my issue with Tulsi is that in the last year or so, she's become a full-on supporter of Israel. She's demonized people in the U.S. protesting genocide. She accuses Hamas of having a global jihadist agenda, which is just such a lie. And that's been sad to watch. But for all the reasons that Nikki Haley just laid out, those are reasons why Tulsi Gabbard, I think, would be a great pick. I mean, Nikki Haley just made the case, I think, very forcefully for Tulsi Gabbard. And by the way, Tulsi Gabbard is seen as like somehow, like as Nikki Haley said, she was particularly outraged that Tulsi Gabbard would challenge allegations of chemical weapons use by the Syrian government as lodged by the U.S. But listen, just putting aside all the evidence that we've reported on the Grayzone, put aside the OPCW cover up, the whistleblowers who said their own investigation in Duma, which is one of the cases Nikki Haley mentioned that was compromised and censored. Putting aside all that, even U.S. intelligence officials have joined Tulsi Gabbard in questioning these allegations. Back when Obama was preparing to attack Syria over allegations of chemical weapons by the government in Ghouta, top U.S. intelligence officials working under Jim Clapper, they leaked the fact that the intelligence, in their words, was not a slam dunk. And they did that to invoke the term used during the
by George
Iraq War by George Tenet of the CIA, when he said that the intelligence of Iraq's WMDs is a slam dunk. So here they were warning that we had another Iraq WMD type scam. So this is top intelligence officials warning this. And someone who would be Tulsi Gabbard's predecessor, James Clapper, even used that term with Obama. He said it's not a slam dunk. So she's not only correct if you look at the available evidence, which you can read about at the Grayzone, unfortunately almost nowhere else, but even if it's going by what other intelligence officials have said, she's joining them in her skepticism. So to paint her as some sort of like anomaly who's out there in the wilderness, it's not even factually true, because other intelligence officials have joined her. And I think one of the reasons why there's this neocon freakout is they're worried that Tulsi Gabbard in her position will actually speak the truth and show that allegations like this were a scam, which I don't think they have to worry about. I think Tulsi Gabbard in office will likely fall in line. But the fact that there's even someone who's been been principled before and been a dissident on these issues, they're even near an office of power like this, understandably there's a huge freak out from people whose warmongering relies on lying to the American people.
Russian propaganda. That's all we hear. And conspiracy theories. The New York Times accused Tulsi Gabbard of conspiracy theory by claiming that Ukraine or Russia destroyed the Nord Stream pipelines. I mean, who else would have destroyed them? Are they claiming that we must believe that Russia blew its own pipeline up, which is the ultimate conspiracy theory? So I love the fact that we're at least able to kind of force these debates, and that all they can say is Russian propaganda, but they can't debate any of the issues, whether it's Syrian chemical attacks, Nord Stream pipeline, why did Russia invade Ukraine, all of these issues. Why is North Korea doing ballistic missile tests? All of these key issues about U.S. empire that Tulsi Gabbard raised at various points, even in milquetoast ways, they can't actually discuss them on the merits. It would be great to get one of those critics of Tulsi Gabbard who just utters Russian propaganda every time they hear something they don't like on the Grayzone to debate that live. I don't know if we'll be able to do that, but we do have Ambassador Craig Murray. I think he has a solid Wi-Fi connection, so we need to get him in here. Let's welcome back Ambassador Craig Murray and hope that his internet is adequate. Craig, can
Hi
you?
there.
All right.
I think solid is a bit optimistic, but it's holding at the moment.
Great.
We'll take it.
We'll take what we can get because your analysis is solid gold. So tell us, I mean, you're in Beirut right now. Tell us about how you got there, how you got your media credentials, and what you've seen so far, and how it differs from the view of the war that's being portrayed by Western media.
Yeah, I mean, it's very different to what's being portrayed by Western media, although it's remarkable how very little of what's happening in Lebanon is actually being portrayed by Western media at all. I came here because I'd done what I could with helping initiate the case to the ICJ and with lobbying at the UN. And I thought, what can I do next to try to counteract this genocide? And I thought probably obviously I can't get into Gaza. I tried to get into the West Bank and the Israelis won't let me in there. And I thought, well, no one could stop me going to Beirut. So I thought I'd come here and counter from here the Western propaganda about what's happening here. And I think I've been arrested by pretty well every party to this conflict over the last 2 weeks. But fortunately, I shan't go into all the details, but eventually I managed to get media credentials. The Lebanese government will only accept mainstream media credentials. They wouldn't accept my credentials from Consortium News, for example, or from any online publication. You've got to be from the BBC or the Wall Street Journal, which, of course, in itself automatically gives a huge bias to the kind of coverage coming out of Ukraine, coming out of Lebanon. Except, of course, those people aren't here anyway. The Wall Street Journal flew in for 3 days. The BBC and CNN have got no interest at all in reporting what's really happening here. They're in Tel Aviv reporting the Israeli spin on what's happening in Lebanon. And what's happening here are intense levels of bombardment. There are about 70,000 homes destroyed in the south of Lebanon. Approximately 70,000 homes have been destroyed. 1.2 million people are displaced. 450,000 of those have gone into Syria. A couple of 100,000 of those who could have got out into the west. And then there are about 600,000 people, refugees in Beirut and the north of the country. And Israel is simply carpet bombing. Israel is flattening the Shia districts. It continues its targeted attacks on Hezbollah figures, but much more importantly, it's targeting the refugee exodus, if you like. It's targeting, I was there 2 days ago at a site where they blew up a refugee aid center where refugees went to pick up food packages, and that was deliberate targeting. And they killed 5 people there and seriously injured 19 people and blew up a ton of aid. And they've blown up over 60 ambulances have been destroyed deliberately. Over 220 medics and paramedics have been killed. It's the Gaza playbook again. It's in the fairly early stages. So far, the total dead is 3,500. But that's still an awful lot of dead people, but they're doing it by the Gaza playbook: hospitals, health centers, ambulances, medical workers, aid centers for refugees. And it's almost not reported at all in the West.
As well as the sort of social services that Hezbollah provides. And they'll just say this was a Hezbollah target, which sustain a large percentage of the population, the Shia population especially, which is much poorer than the rest of the population. Amos Hochstein was just in Beirut. Is he still there?
No, he's now in Tel Aviv, I think. He left Beirut last night.
So he's gone home to Tel Aviv in some sense because he's an Israeli citizen, a veteran of the Israeli military, and somehow this is the liaison or the envoy that the U.S. sends to negotiate a ceasefire. Here is Amos Hochstein in Starbucks their day in Beirut. And this is in an area in Beirut.
Wait.
I think this is like on the Corniche, right on the Mediterranean. It's a wealthier area. I think it's like the Ain Meresi neighborhood. So you have a lot of kind of pro-U.S. lackeys, wealthier members of the Sunni population that hate Hezbollah, and they're sort of treating him as a celebrity and saying to the barista, don't charge him. This is one of the only Israelis that would be allowed in Lebanon at all.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, when I came in, I spent about half an hour proving that I'd never been to Israel. Because if you've ever been to Israel, you're not allowed into the country. And yet here they're welcoming a former member of the Israeli Defense Forces. One of the problems when I was arrested for trying to do journalism without a permit, I do not have a permit, I should say. Well, when I was arrested, was they went through all the numbers on my telephone and they found one with a 972 code number, which of course is Israel, but is also the code number for occupied Palestine.
Right.
It was actually a Palestinian's phone number, but they that caused great trouble. Now, I mean, what Hochstein is doing is absolutely disgusting, and the position of the United States is absolutely disgusting because they are preparing the way for eventual Israeli annexation of southern Lebanon. The carpet bombing there, but the incredible destruction. I mean, villages are being totally destroyed, as in every single structure in the village is being destroyed, and small towns, and even the city of Nakamatiyah. That they're just wiping it out like they're wiping out Gaza. And the idea is to make it uninhabitable. And the long-term plan, or even the medium to short-term plan, is Israeli annexation. And they are calling for Hezbollah to disarm and move north of the Litani River. But in the peace agreement, it says that Israel will be able, it doesn't even say Israel will be able to attack in response to any attack by Hezbollah. It says that Israel will be able to enter and attack sub-Lebanon against imminent threat. So nothing has to have happened. Israel just needs to have decided there's an imminent threat. It means Israel can enter anytime they want, and that's in the peace deal. And the other thing in the so-called peace deal is that the United States is to be the guarantor, and the United States is to judge whether or not there really is an imminent threat. Which is again, the Lebanese would be crazy to sign up to this. There are, as you say, there are pro-Israeli elements in Lebanon. But my experience here is that those elements are not dominant. That they're definitely not dominant, and they're shrinking. They're especially shrinking among younger people. And I'm staying here in a predominantly Christian area, and I've been here for nearly a month now, and got to know a lot of people. And undoubtedly, in this Christian area, the overwhelming sentiment is anti-Israeli, very anti-Israeli, and anti-Zionist. And with young people in particular, but with everybody. The people here are just as horrified at the genocide in Gaza as everybody else. Everybody's seeing the same things on their mobile telephones. And the idea that, that Lebanese Christians automatically support Israel is simply wrong. The large majority of them do not. And actually the ferocity of the Israeli attack on the south of the country, which has been indiscriminate, which has blasted Christian villages in the south as much as it's blasted Muslim villages in the south.
Yeah.
The ferocity has helped actually, I think, reaffirm Lebanese identity. There's a minority of the Sunni, the extreme jihadist Sunnis, the al-Nusra, al-Qaeda supporting bunch, Saudi funded, and there's still Saudi influence through mosques, through Sunni mosques here, which is pro-Israeli and pro-American. But again, I don't think, and it's going to take me longer to be sure, but I don't think that's even the majority of the Sunni population now.
Well, let's talk about, because we led in with Amos Hochstein visiting. He's saying that there could be a ceasefire. We're looking right now at footage of Israeli soldiers destroying a village in southern Lebanon that is home to a 2,000-year-old shrine to the prophet Benjamin. This is the kind of destruction that they're visiting on holy sites, archaeological sites, and villages that well predate the modern apartheid regime of Israel. And Amos Hochstein, every time he comes to Lebanon or to the region, it seems to be followed by more vicious attacks on Beirut than usual. We saw in his previous visit, before the one which has him in Tel Aviv right now, he attempted to strong-arm Nabi Berri, the parliamentary speaker in Lebanon, into accepting the onerous terms that you were describing earlier. And when he didn't, Israel attacked areas that were controlled by the Amal movement, which is allied with Hezbollah and represents the constituency of Berri. So it looked like a message from Amos Hochstein, who former UN official and whistleblower Craig Mokhiber has compared to Tom Hagen, the consigliere to Vito Corleone, the Godfather. What exactly does the U.S. want Lebanon to agree to, and will it even be possible within Lebanon's system?
Very hard to see how they can agree. It's worth noting, of course, that the United States is building its second largest embassy in the world here in Lebanon. And of course, people may wonder, Lebanon is a country of 5 million people. And it's not even a particularly wealthy country of 5 million people. People may wonder why the United States needs its second largest embassy in the whole world in Lebanon. And of course, that's a hub for all kinds of things, for intelligence activity, for the NSA, for special forces, and for exerting control more widely in the region. And the United States is constantly in play to absolutely control the Lebanese political system, which is where Hezbollah is for them the obstacle that needs to be removed, because Hezbollah is, of course, the largest political party in the country. We are seeing now exactly what you said. I mean, there were massive bombs in Beirut this morning. It felt and sounded larger than anything we've seen before recently. And at the moment, I'm sure your noise cancellation will take it out. But the drones are constant and incessant and very, very loud overhead today. There's several drones circling not far away from me at all. And this is terrorism to persuade Lebanon effectively to dismantle Hezbollah, which is what the United States aim is. And I say, I mean, I've always believed that the United States has been firmly committed to the annexation, to Greater Israel, and to the annexation of Gaza, the annexation of the West Bank. And I believe that also extends to the annexation, at least, of southern Lebanon. And I think that is the end goal. And I've never understood that people fell at any stage for the Biden administration's talk of attempting to restrain Israel in Gaza, when the worse the worse the genocide got, the more money and the more weapons they gave them. Actions speak a great deal louder than words, and here, the bombs that are killing Lebanese children here in Beirut overnight will be American bombs given by the American people, not sold, given. So yeah, we're back in that playbook again, which is you try to devastate the country and terrorize the population until they accept your terms. And ultimately, I believe the United States is attempting to restart the civil war and get the other populations to turn on Hezbollah. But I also genuinely believe that's not working. I do think what the United States is doing here is helping forge a new and stronger Lebanese national identity, especially among younger people.
Yeah, we saw the U.S. ambassador to Lebanon actually hold meetings with, I think, Samir Jaja of Lebanese forces, who's a U.S. ally or tool, and other forces opposed to Hezbollah, and actually encourage them to kind of rise up and take the initiative, which sounds like civil war talk, but Lebanese people are rejecting it. Do you think the attacks, the indiscriminate attacks, are actually causing more unity and possibly support, like we saw in 2006 for Hezbollah, outside of their normal sectarian support base?
Yeah, I'm quite sure that's true. I had dinner with some people from major political families in Lebanon, not the heads of the family, but members of major political families in Lebanon, none of whom were Shia. And all of them were saying that they are, in the current crisis, they support Hezbollah. They support Hezbollah against Israel. There's a great deal of anger in the country that the Lebanese army is not participating, and that anger was expressed to me by quite a few rather unexpected people. People are getting behind Hezbollah. People from out with the Shia community in the fight between Israel and Hezbollah. People side with Hezbollah because they are defending the country, and nobody else is defending the country.
Yeah. So how do you assess the military situation? Israel was about a month ago in a state of pure triumphalism. You had the pager attack, which really targeted reservists in Hezbollah, not frontline fighters and their families and first responders and anyone associated with the overall political infrastructure. So it was basically a widespread terror attack. Then you had the assassination of Nasrallah and his supposed successor, Safieddin. But now it appears Israel its target bank is kind of exhausted. It's just killed Mohammed Afif, who is the media relations director, not a military commander, as journalist Hala Jabber points out, never in hiding and one of the least concealed members of the organization. And Jabber says, the murder of Mohammed Afif only goes to show the nature of this cowardly entity that has run out of alleged targets and is so bankrupt and unhinged in committing war crimes. I met with his predecessor, Ibrahim Moussaoui, who just operated openly in the media relations office of Hezbollah, meeting all sorts of journalists. He even met with the current editor-in-chief of The Atlantic and former Israeli soldier Jeffrey Goldberg, who apparently fabricated quotes by him, now serves in the parliament. So they're just killing political figures and spokespeople. I guess this, since Hezbollah believes in reciprocity, kind of one-for-one reciprocity, this puts a target on the back of Israel's vast army of international propagandists connected to the government, that they would take it to this level. But what does this say to you about the state of Israel's military campaign, given that Hezbollah has been able to consistently hit back and even hit Tel Aviv several days ago with a ballistic missile?
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that Israel's, inability to make progress on the ground, I think, is a real problem for Israel. And it isn't that they haven't been trying. They have been trying to establish bases, to establish firm beachheads, but they've not been able to hold anywhere really for more than a few days. In the last couple of days, there does seem to have been a more determined push by the Israelis trying to reach the coast road and take and then make progress up the main coast road. There does seem to be some sign at the moment that they are trying to make a larger ground advance than they've tried to make previously. But that's encountering obviously very stiff resistance, and I don't think that's going to develop in a major way. But of course they don't have to. And what they concentrate on doing, because Lebanon seems to have no effective air defense whatsoever, is simply pounding the country from the air and trying to pound it into submission on really the Gaza playbook. And this is what concerns me most deeply. I can see nothing that stops them doing this for a year until there are 50,000 dead and 2 million homeless, and the entire south of Lebanon is a total wasteland, as would be large portions of Beirut. And that's, of course, what they're holding. That's the threat they're holding up to the Lebanese people. That they're essentially threatening annihilation from the air. And unless somebody steps in to stop them, the Lebanese can't stop them, and Israel is not showing at the moment any signs of running out of the political will to stop it.
Yeah.
And Western states don't seem to be taking it seriously at all.
Yeah. So it does seem, actually, Naim Qassem, who's the new Secretary General of Hezbollah, made some interesting comments that, first of all, Hezbollah is not a traditional military, so its goal is not to block another conventional military from taking territory. Its goal is to extract as many casualties and make it as painful as possible for that military to advance, in expectation of what seems to be an attempted Israeli push forward, which signals desperation, I think, on Netanyahu's part. But the weapons, the air bridge just continues indefinitely to Israel, to the Nevatim air base in the Negev desert, which makes an air war that possible for Israel to carry out through the Trump administration, when it will be granted total carte blanche to destroy and destroy and destroy. And it's just bombing random civilian homes and structures, it seems. How do you see one of the few factors here that could actually deter these continued Israeli attacks is Iran, and Iran's ability to strike Israel, including striking the Nevatim air base. But the Iranian response has not come since the last Israeli attack, in which Israel claimed, and I don't know what you think about its claims, to have taken out several S-300 launchers. Now they're leaking through their favorite journalists in Washington like Barak Ravid at Axios, that they actually hit some Iranian nuclear facilities, some enrichment facilities. How could Iran factor in here? And, if Israel intends to keep going for another year, how could Iran not get involved?
If Israel does intend to keep going for another year, I think Iran is bound to be drawn in. Then, of course, you have the difficulty as to how crazy the Trump administration is going to be. One of the problems, of course, that's simply an unknown factor. He's certainly filled his cabinet with pro-Israeli crazy people, but Trump himself remains extremely unpredictable, and obviously any major war involving Iran in the region is going to have drastic economic impact on the United States and on the rest of the world in a way which would not really fit well with Trump's domestic agenda, which is to show that he can bring economic growth to the United States. So I think Trump's going to be wary of entering full-scale war with Iran. But what we haven't seen, what I thought we would see, is more of this kind of measured strike, because it's been a strange kind of minuet between Israel and Iran, where a certain amount of lethality and strike, but carefully measured and metered out, has been returned at intervals of a few weeks. And I guess in that game, it's the Iranians' turn. But at no stage have the Iranians really tried to inflict the kind of damage on the Israelis that would actually stop them. And that would involve what's really needed in order to save Lebanon are all-out attacks on Israel's air bases, as you say. That's in a major way, and not just a few missiles. Basically, Israel's air force needs to be taken out. It's hard to see that happening. I'm actually feeling quite pessimistic at the moment. My feeling is that this war is going to go on and on. I should say, in the long term, I don't think Israel survives this whole situation. I think Israel has now reached the stage, as with apartheid South Africa, where there's so much hatred towards it, so much of a pariah in the rest of the world, that's going to eventually feed through and have institutional consequences, and states are going to stop trading and stop supporting. That's on the way. But in the short term, what can save Gaza? What can save the West Bank? What can save Lebanon? I don't see much in the next year or two. I apologize for being pessimistic, Max. It's just where I am.
Well, you're closer to the front than I am. Is that pessimism reflected in your conversations with people around Beirut?
Lebanese people are incredibly resilient. I think resilient is the most important word I would use to describe them. And they've been through so much. They've been through war. They've been through financial collapse. They've been through that massive fertilizer explosion here in Beirut. Before that, they had Israeli occupation, and they've always survived it. And for Lebanese people, this is just something else the world is throwing at them, and they will get through it. But they are deeply worried about what the next 2 months bring. But that doesn't feed into a willingness to surrender, because what's being asked for is basically complete surrender and abnegation of sovereignty. And the Lebanese are proud people. I don't think that's going to happen.
Aaron, let me know if you want to give me a thumbs up if you want to return. I see you in the green room. Craig, had another run-in with the law in the UK for comments you made about the situation in Gaza and Lebanon. There are new laws on the books in the UK that govern what you can and can't say, and more people are being raided in the UK under these supposed anti-terror laws. So what happened there? And can you tell us also about the situation with the National Union of Journalists, which is apparently refused to support you for, I think, unspecified reasons?
Yeah. Well, it's about a year now since I was personally arrested under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And I was one of the first people to be arrested because of their support for Palestine. Since then, it's been increasing and increasing and increasing. And now there are dozens of people every week being arrested by the police under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And it is illegal in UK law to express any opinion which may cause somebody else to support Hamas or Hezbollah, which are designated terrorist organizations. So the legal judgment is: would what you say make somebody else support Hamas? And there's some interesting things there. It doesn't mean it would have to convince anybody who heard it to support Hamas. If it were capable of convincing one person to support Hamas, then you would be guilty. And this rather wide definition of law carries 14 years in jail. I mean, it's not it's not a minor infringement. Up to 14 years in jail for expressing support or encouraging support for a terrorist organization. And many of us in the pro-Palestinian movement, I support openly Palestine's right to armed resistance. The Palestinians, as an occupied people, have a legal right to armed resistance. Problem is, if I say that, which is merely a true statement of international law, in the eyes of the British state, I am encouraging support for Hamas, even though I didn't mention Hamas and didn't say. I just said I support the right of armed resistance. But we've had people arrested under the Terrorism Act for saying "from the river to the sea." We had 2 girls arrested for having a picture of a hang glider, which was thought to refer to the October 7th demonstration, all deemed as terrorism. And of course, the problem comes from this law under which, once an organisation is prescribed by the British government as a terrorist organisation, you're not allowed to argue that it isn't a terrorist organisation.
Right.
So, Hezbollah, according to the British government, is a terrorist organisation. If I say to you, well, it's actually a political party in the Lebanon, it's got 40% of the members of parliament, it runs hospitals and healthcare, it even runs farms, it has this huge welfare division, which is important to the state. If I say that, I'm potentially at danger of being charged and sent to jail for 14 years for saying something supportive of Hezbollah. So it's a law in which you're not allowed to say the state is wrong. Had this law been in power, had this law been in force in the 1980s and 1990s, it would have been illegal to say "free Nelson Mandela," because Nelson Mandela was part of the ANC, which the UK designated a terrorist organisation. And in fact, it was the official position of the UK government while he was in jail that Nelson Mandela was a terrorist and had been found guilty of terrorism in a free and fair trial. That was the official, an apartheid court, a free and fair trial. That was the official position of the British government. So it would have been illegal and terrorism to campaign for the release of Nelson Mandela if this legislation were enforced, because you would not have been allowed to argue he's not a terrorist. Similarly, you're not allowed to argue Hamas and Hezbollah are not terrorists. So, this is Orwellian. This is really crazy. If the government designated the Girl Guides as terrorists, then the law would apply and you would be jailed if you expressed support for the Girl Guides. So, but the raids, but the police raids have been horrible. I mean, we had the example of Sarah Wilkinson, who was raided by 16 armed police, some in balaclavas, bursting into a house at 6 a.m. They turned over her entire house and they tipped her mother's ashes from an urn onto the floor.
Richard Medhurst.
Yep, Richard Medhurst was taken off the plane on the tarmac at Heathrow Airport, held in poor conditions for 24 hours and subjected. And under this legislation, if you're arrested at an airport, you're not entitled to a lawyer and you don't have the right to remain silent. You don't have what are called Miranda rights in the US if you're arrested at an airport under this legislation, which is what happened to me also. I was arrested at an airport. And there was an example just in the last 2 days of a 77-year-old woman, pro-Palestinian activist, who the police came to her home before dawn in sub-freezing temperatures and removed her from her home in her pajamas with no shoes on, and kept her outside in her pajamas in sub-freezing temperatures for several hours, and would not allow her to go out, get any clothing, would not allow her to take any clothing from her neighbors. And this is a lady who's 77 years old. This is the United Kingdom, you know, this sort of Gestapo tactic against pro-Palestinian activists is happening in the UK. It's actually very, very difficult to believe.
And we also had Asa Winstanley from Electronic Intifada raided. We had, I think Vanessa Beeley may have also been.
Yeah, Vanessa Beeley was earlier, but yes, she's
interrogated at some point. Here's footage of a raid from on several people's homes. I think associated with Palestine Action. And this is also under the Terrorism Act.
Yeah, this is all under the Terrorism Act. Richard Barnard of Palestine Action has been charged under the Terrorism Act. It, you know, basically opposing a genocide is illegal. And the extraordinary thing is, as I say, if I said to you that, you know, Hezbollah run hospitals and provide health services and do it quite well, that could well lead to being arrested under the Terrorism Act. I can stand in the UK in the public square and I can say, I support the genocide in Gaza. I support Israel. I want Israel to kill all Palestinians. I support this. And that's not against the law at all. That's perfectly legal to say that. It's an astonishing skewed piece of legislation which is simply completely inappropriate to the situation in the Middle East. And it's being used much more under Starmer. I mean, Starmer and the Labour Party have, you know, absolutely supercharged the use of this legislation against opponents of Israel. At the same time, of course, that Starmer has doubled down on refusing to say that there's a genocide and has been going about saying actively supporting Israel. The British ambassador to Israel yesterday, I believe, or the day before, made a speech in Israel in which he said that if Israel were attacked by Iran, British servicemen would be put in harm's way and would fight alongside Israel against Iran, which is quite incredible. I'm sure the general public would be astonished to hear that. But he couldn't have made that speech without it being authorized by Starmer.
Yeah. Starmer said there's no equivalence between Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah. I guess in a way he's right.
Exactly. It's the only thing he's ever said where I've agreed with him. There is no equivalence between Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah.
What happened here, Craig? You said your membership in the National Union of Journalists was refused because you were deemed not fit and proper. because of social
Yeah,
media posts?
I should be plain. I should have been more plain in that tweet. This was 2 years ago, exactly. In fact, that I was expelled from the National Union of Journalists as not a fit and proper person, and they refused to tell me why. They told me it was because members who worked at the BBC had complained about my social media posts, but they refused to show me the social media posts they were complaining about. So exactly what I said that upset them so much, I have no idea, which was quite extraordinary. But this is, the National Union of Journalists in the UK, the majority of its members nowadays actually work for public relations firms. And of course, most of the rest work for the BBC or billionaire media. There's a very, very small number of people from the alternative media in the
Right.
NUJ, and most of the membership see the alternative media as either the enemy or a threat. So they're not. It's kind of not surprising. Perhaps I got kicked out, but still, it was extremely annoying, and it's actually unhelpful because it means I can't get an International Federation of Journalists card. I've spoken to the IFJ, Dominique, the head of it, who is horrified at what was done to me. But the way their constitution works, unless I'm a member of the NUJ, I can't get an IFJ card. So I don't have that kind of newspaper, or not newspaper, that kind of press credential, that kind of internationally recognized journalist credential, which is very difficult for me when I'm trying to work in a place like this.
And the National Union of Journalists also refused to support Kit Klarenberg when he was detained, pulled off an airplane at Luton International Airport and hauled into an interrogation room for 8 hours by British counter-terror police and grilled about his legitimate journalism for the Grayzone as well as this outlet itself, then placed under investigation under I don't know what provision it was. The National Security Act was subsequent to Kit's interrogation and forbids the publication of any material that is seen as damaging to British national security, whatever that means. But the National Union of Journalists initially supported him and then retracted it under pressure from, I guess, fellow neocons. So it just really speaks to how corroded British media institutions are. And of course, Americans don't understand about the D-Notice Committee in the UK, which can put major issues of public importance behind in a national security lockbox. And the D-Notice Committee includes many journalists, including editors of The Guardian and Huffington Post UK, publications like that. So it's just it's one of the most corrupt media environments on the planet. I guess it's a badge of honor, honestly, to be deemed not fit and proper for this bogus union.
I think that's right. And one of the most famous examples of the use of the D-Notice Committee was, of course, the famous case of the Sripals, who were allegedly poisoned with Novichok, and they lived in Salisbury, very close to the house of their MI6 handler, Pablo Miller. And Pablo Miller was with them in ZZ's restaurant just before they fell ill. And of course, the official story, which is unbelievable, is that they touched the Novichok on their door handle. Then they went shopping. Then they went to a restaurant and ate 3-course meal. And then only after that did they both simultaneously and instantaneously pass out from Novichok. So they were both too sick instantaneously for either of them to call for help. It's plainly a complete and utter nonsense. The stuff, if they had been poisoned with Novichok, it certainly doesn't take 4 hours to take effect and then knock you out instantly. That's just ludicrous. And the other thing, of course, is that the first person on the scene just happened by chance to be the chief nurse of the British Army, which I thought was lovely. But
just happened to be walking by when they passed out on a park bench.
Exactly. She just happened to be shopping, in fact, and just walked by. There you are. That genuinely is the official story. But the D-Notice Committee put out a D-Notice on Pablo Miller, saying that nobody was to publish his name or mention him at all, even though they had been having lunch with an MI6 agent. And the interesting thing on this is that in the public inquiry into it, which was being held this week, evidence was given by the police, which gave the evidence of the doctor who questioned Julia Sripal when she first became conscious again. And she replied to him by blinking her eyes once or twice for yes or no. And he asked her where she was sprayed. The doctor believed, I don't know why the doctor believed she had been sprayed with the poison. That's what the doctor believed he had happened. I assume he had a reason for believing that. So he asked her whether she had been sprayed with the poison, and she responded yes. And then he asked her where she had been sprayed with the poison, and she answered yes on Zizi's restaurant. And he asked her again, and she answered yes again, that she had been sprayed with poison in Zizi's restaurant, which of course makes much more sense because they staggered out of the restaurant and collapsed. That's much more likely than they touched it 4 hours earlier. But the person who was in Zizi's restaurant with them was Pablo Miller.
Wow.
Where they were sprayed with poison. Now, the evidence was that all that evidence was given in public, and it was then ruled out of order by the judge heading the inquiry as being hearsay. Even though they had the doctor's transcript of it, they had the written transcript of it the doctor made at the time was submitted, but it was decided that was hearsay, and so that is not admitted as evidence in the inquiry, but everybody saw it and heard it. So there you are. You have Pablo Miller, who doesn't exist, and no media ever publishes his name, and not allowed to publish his name because there's a D notice. He was with them when they were sprayed with Novichok, and I'm as you know, I'm not going to make any inferences for matters to who sprayed them with the Novichok, but I think there's one. Assuming it was Novichok, who sprayed them with whatever they were sprayed with. But the most obvious suspect seems to be not to be two Russian agents.
Which is amazing. Pablo Miller also, I think, was at Orbis Communications with Christopher Steele. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So for those of you just joining us, Aaron Mate has not morphed into a seasoned Englishman. We're speaking to Ambassador Craig Murray, who is live from Beirut. We've discussed the situation in Lebanon, and now we're on to another area, an issue that Craig has covered in detail, to the chagrin and anger of the British national security state, which is the Sripal poisoning incident, which was really critical, I think, to deepening the new Cold War with Russia. It was such an important incident, and also bringing Britain into Russiagate and activating Britain as a player in the war against Russia. So there's this Dawn Sturgis inquiry taking place. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
So who is Dawn Sturgis? And I guess if anyone wants any background on this, go to our YouTube channel at the Grayzone and watch my previous interview with Craig Murray, because he gives the full background on Sripal. But who is Dawn Sturgis, and why does this inquiry matter, and where will it lead?
Dawn Sturgis was an unfortunate lady who died of poisoning, unlike the Sripals. And the official story is this. The official story is that these Russian agents poisoned the Sripals by painting Novichok on their door handle, even though, as I just said, Yulia herself said that they were sprayed with, or indicated that they were sprayed with Novichok in the restaurant some hours later. And the official story is that the Novichok was in a perfume bottle, which the Russian agents then disposed of in a charity bin. And that 3 to 4 months later, a friend of Dawn Sturgis, named Charlie Rowley, stole the perfume from within the charity bin and gave it to Dawn as a present. She then sprayed it on herself and died. He also sprayed it on himself, Charlie Rowley, but didn't die. Again, there are some severe problems with this narrative, of which the most important one is that the Russian agents allegedly, because Charlie Rowley stated that when he got the perfume bottle, it was sealed. The cellophane around the box was sealed. He had to unseal it all and open it up. So according to the official story, having sprayed Novichok on the door handle, the Russian agents somehow in the street got all the bottle back together again and resealed the cellophane and then dropped it in. Why? And then dropped it how and why, and then dropped it in this charity box. And this charity box, it's a charity collection bin. It was emptied on a regular basis. It was emptied approximately weekly. Yes.
Watch this. This is interesting footage here from the inquiry. So the person is always in the background, and he starts kind of cracking a smile when they're told that the Russians brought a portable heat sealer with them to Salisbury.
That they used it. I believe they dismantled it. I believe they placed it into the plastic packaging and then using a portable heat sealer, sealed some of the component parts of the device into plastic packaging, which then went into the box.
It's not. And the whole, we're told that this, a drop, one minuscule drop of this substance would kill you. They're supposed to have painted the door handle with a perfume bottle, from a perfume bottle with this substance, while not wearing any protective clothing at all. They're spraying it on, and one drop kills you. And they're not wearing any protective clothing of any kind, which seems to me wildly improbable. And then they're replacing the perfume bottle in the street. They don't go anywhere. They're not going into a house or into a premise. In the street somehow, they get the perfume bottle all back in the box, and then reseal the cellophane with a portable heat sealer, and then throw it in the charity bin. Why would you reseal it? Why would you carry it with you? Where are you carrying this portable heat sealer? And what is its energy source? What is a portable heat sealer? Have you ever seen a portable heat sealer for refilling cellophane on perfume bottles? Is there actually such a thing? Anyway, obviously the Russian Secret Service have invented a portable heat sealer for perfume bottles, and they carried it with them and did this.
Portable
But
heat
then,
sealer.
of course, poor Dawn Sturgis died, and she wasn't given an inquest, needless to say, a bit like David Kelly. There's instead this public inquiry, which is a farce, because, as I say, all the key evidence gets ruled out as hearsay and not important. And the whole thing is a charade to... that's why it's a public inquiry instead of a proper coroner's inquest. It's a charade to reinforce the anti-Russian propaganda. And none of the media calls out the obvious rubbish. There are bits of this story which are just so obviously untrue that people should be falling over laughing at them, as that guy was in the inquiry. But everybody just goes along with the charade. And you're right, that just goes. There couldn't be a more telling commentary on Britain's so-called journalists that nobody has called this out.
No, none of them asked questions. They didn't ask questions about Duma. They didn't ask questions about Sripal. You're not allowed to ask questions because then you're accused of echoing Russian propaganda and you're out of a job. But this one deserved so many questions. I mean, why did the pets have to be killed of Yulia Sripal? If she was sprayed in a restaurant, then would an autopsy of the pets not have shown that they were not affected by Novichok at all, which was supposedly placed on their doorknob? Why did they have to be killed and then disappeared? I mean, that seemed to be a pretty big red flag, and no one in the media asked about it. Why were the ducks poisoned? How were these ducks poisoned? And Gina Haspel, then CIA director, was running around showing pictures of dead ducks to Donald Trump to get him to authorize more sanctions on Russia and cancel meetings with Putin. I mean, it all seemed pretty obvious what was going on here, but you were one of the few people asking questions and you wound up in jail. I mean, you were targeted.
Oh, very much so. I was actually targeted for. I was actually jailed officially for contempt of court in another case.
Yeah, but I mean, it all folded into that case. They were looking for
it was all
an opening.
Exactly. And the Sripals.
So what? Jigsaw identification. You identified a witness who had already been identified by the press. I mean, it was obvious that they were just looking for something they could finagle into a prosecution because you had upset them.
Yeah, that's right. I upset them greatly over the Sripal thing, and of course over Julian Assange. In fact, I'm just generally not one of their favourite people.
Yeah,
they were quite keen to get me, but no, it's very sad. The media landscape in the UK is very sad. We lost John Pilger recently, of course, and John hadn't been able to get onto mainstream television for 15 years or so, despite the fact he was still making great documentaries and was arguably the greatest documentary maker of the last century. And there's just nobody replacing him. There is nobody making documentaries which challenge the official line rather than reinforce the official line. If you wanted to make a documentary that challenged the official line, you would never ever get funding. You'd never get commissioned. It's just not possible to do it within the mainstream media nowadays.
Well, in the mainstream media, but I should note that we have more viewers right now on this stream than MSNBC has in the United States. I'm not even exaggerating. The mainstream media is in a state of collapse. And it's another reason why they're passing these new laws to clamp down on all speech they can't control. Because as John Kerry said, while practically sitting in Klaus Schwab's lap in Davos, it's harder to enforce consensus and make policy based on that consensus than ever before because of social and alternative media. So we are going to face a blitzkrieg of censorship from the exponents of a failing corporate media.
Yeah. There's a new Online Security Act. Of course, all these things are always security.
Yeah.
And it's always to protect you from paedophilia. That's always the rationale for controls on the internet. Starmer has already said that they're going to introduce a clause into the new Online Safety Act to make the spreading of misinformation or disinformation illegal. So the government's going to decide, what's true and what's not true, and if they believe that you're spreading disinformation, for example, just exactly the kind of thing we've just been saying about the Sripal case, is going to become illegal. It's going to become illegal to challenge the government narrative. And I fear we really are heading into that kind of dystopia, possibly faster in the UK than you are in the US, but I think you're heading in the same direction as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're seeing that with the collapse of the so-called rules-based order, that internally the West is lifting the mask on the liberal democratic patina that has always been there since the rise of US hegemony after World War II, and the propaganda model that has sustained liberal democracy that was best distilled in Michael Parenti's Inventing Reality or Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. It's no longer sustainable. And so, with this deepening authoritarianism in the collective West, we're also seeing rising consciousness among the general population. And these kind of conversations that we're having now are just happening more openly and more frequently and more prominently than ever before. And so I think there is a cause for hope. We've been able to build the Grayzone into kind of an independent media institution just thanks to so many members of the public who have gotten fed up with corporate media. And I think it's a dead model, just like our electoral system in the US. I think we're going to see a lot of people who supported Trump for whatever reason, MAGA supporters, realize that America First was almost as empty a brand as Black Lives Matter has become, the brand that they constantly denounce. But it's going to take some time. And at that point, where will they go? Where will anyone go? Where can they go in the UK after Labour's been taken over by the forces that have always controlled Keir Starmer's career? Where can they go? I mean, George Galloway is trying to provide them with some kind of political space in the UK through the Workers' Party. But Labour tries to destroy the Workers' Party as well. So where can anyone go at this point to express themselves? I mean, what is the way forward, Craig? I mean, I know this is kind of a general question, but and I want to ask you one more question about Ukraine before we go. But what do you think the way forward is for people to not just vent their outrage about what's happening in Lebanon and Gaza and Ukraine, or the austerity that's being visited on their own communities, but to actually enact meaningful political change?
I think it's very plain indeed that the political parties no longer give any real choice that's going to make any difference to the position of the ordinary working person. It just doesn't. There's just no choice out there that's going to help you. And the populism of Trump or people like Farage in the UK does, capitalize on an anti-establishment mood, but doesn't actually really genuinely threaten to change anything in the establishment once it's elected. And the fundamental problem is the massive concentration of wealth. That for 20 years, real wages for ordinary people across the Western world have been stagnant. And so it feels like for 20 years there's been no economic growth. Actually, there's been quite large economic growth. Over that 20-year period, the total net increase in economic growth across the G7 countries is approaching 40%. But when you've got that and no increase in the pay of the average worker, that means that all of that extra rent has gone to billionaires, and that's just true. There's now a massive billionaire class or small billionaire class holding absolutely massive resources, and that's the fundamental problem with this part of late stage capitalism we're in. And it's leading to such inequality and such lack of social mobility and such struggle for ordinary people, but I can't see it as long-term sustainable. And eventually, political systems will have to arise which give an outlet for the popular discontent in a way that isn't just the populist banging on, but not actually changing that system. But how that comes about is quite difficult. In the UK, again, we're further down the road in the collapse of the two-party system than you are in the States. At the last election, Starmer was elected with 32% of those
Right.
voting.
Right.
32% of the people who voted for Labour, which is, I think it was I think it's been lower than that once in history. In the 1930s, when the old Liberal Party was still a bit of a factor, so effectively you had three parties. But that's to have a massive majority when only 32% of those who voted for you. He's already the most unpopular prime minister in recent history, and he's only just started. And he's starting from an extremely low base of negative personal popularity. So something's going to give. But we haven't yet been through the properly populist stage. My worry is that what comes next is the Trump equivalent, which is something like Farage or someone similar. I think we're to go into our Trump stage next, possibly. And after that, it's hard to find a way that the system changes without a degree of societal collapse, or at least without a change which is very fast. Yes, that's extraordinary. I mean, he's reached Joe Biden levels of disapproval in just 3 months, which is really really impressive.
He's reached Rishi levels.
Yeah, but
I mean, there aren't that many popular politicians in the UK, at least among the Tories and Labour, who could fill the void here. Netanyahu's not particularly popular in Israel either, but he seems to be getting more standing ovations in Western capitals than our own leadership.
I think the system has failed because people realize that for the most part, the politicians themselves, most of the politicians you see are just puppets. They belong to somebody else. They're doing somebody else's bidding, including Israel, of course, and AIPAC, but also including the billionaires who own them, those who are not themselves billionaires, who have more freedom of action. But most of the political class are just puppets. They're not actual leaders as such. They are in power in order to do the bidding of the people who really hold the power. And that is a change, I think. I don't think that was entirely true 30, 40 years ago.
No, it certainly wasn't. And I don't actually think the ICC warrant for Netanyahu and Gallant would have been possible without the proliferation of social media. You can actually look at the ICC case and the ICJ case against Israel for genocide, heavily reliant on social media, including social media taken by members of the Israeli military themselves. The Israeli military is assassinating social media influencers in Gaza. This Rifat Al-Arir being one of them, for things they've said that upset them. So media has moved far beyond the corporate, mainstream, and print realm, and I think it's leading us well beyond where I think even Elon Musk imagines. Someone who contributed $175 million, basically paid for Trump's ground game, and has made himself sort of a third vice president, has more control than any billionaire, direct control over an administration. I don't know if what your thoughts are on Elon or the Trump administration. But I wanted to get your take on the UK role in Ukraine.
It's very worrying. I mean, it seems completely crazy. I mean, crazy as a level which is just difficult to comprehend. The UK was pushing more fiercely than anyone else for the idea of missile strikes deep into Russia. It's not going to have any effect on the balance of the armed conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah.
In order to have an effect on the balance of the conflict in Ukraine, you'd have to launch so many missile strikes that are so powerful that it would be bound to provoke nuclear retaliation.
Yeah.
Sending 5 or 6 missiles to try and hit an oil depot or something like that isn't going to actually change the position on the ground. It's not going to do any good. It's a huge provocation and a risk which I just don't. It's just so hard to know why they're taking it. Other than this, it seems that it partly takes us back to the Sripals in that the Russophobic brand has become essential to the survival of the political class.
Yes.
The idea that they are standing between us and these dreadful enemies from the east is partly what they rely on in order to maintain their dominance and their mystique. If people realise that Russia's actually not going to attack the UK, whatever happens in the Ukraine, unless we attack them first, then the raison d'etre of so much of establishment disappears because it's meant to be attacking us from this fake threat. So all the time they have to poke Russia and make it more of a threat in order to maintain their own position. That's the only way psychologically I can account for what seems utter madness. Otherwise, it's just utterly crazy.
Yeah, and I think we managed to expose some of that craziness through leaks that give readers of the Grayzone an unvarnished view of the kind of internal discussions that went into Britain's role in making the Ukraine proxy war last for as long as possible. This is from part 1 of what is now a part 2 Kit Clarenberg investigation. Leaks expose secret British military cell plotting to keep Ukraine fighting. And right here, you can actually see part of a slideshow that was exhibited for members of the Project Alchemy cell convened by Lieutenant General Charlie Stickland, who's a high-ranking general in the British military, consisting of what he called out-of-the-box thinkers who were going to conceive means of escalating the war and preventing negotiations because it benefited the UK's military elite. This was the same thinking that went into a related secret British initiative funded by taxpayers, the Integrity Initiative. Chris Donnelly, who, by the way, was Sebastian Gorka's thesis advisor. Gorka's now being put up as like deputy for a deputy national security advisor in the Trump administration. Donnelly proposed the Integrity Initiative propaganda farm because they wanted to frighten the British public about the threat of Russia in order to prevent cuts to the British defense budget. And now we have Project Alchemy, which shows top UK military figures conspiring to carry out the Kerch Bridge bombing. And we at the Grayzone actually produced those files in an earlier investigation showing the blueprints for the Kerch Bridge bombing, which took place to covertly train Gladio-style stay-behind forces, emulating one of the most criminal CIA and NATO operations in history across continental Europe during the early 1970s, and to groom the British public for a drop in living standards that would be inevitably caused by the proxy war against Russia, which included an info ops team that planned attacks not just on RT and Sputnik and Russian media, but on independent American media like the Grayzone. We were listed as one of the targets of this Project Alchemy cell. So here you can see a high-level British military cell plotting to extend the Ukraine proxy war for as long as possible, no matter how much it hurt the European economy, the British economy, no matter how many Ukrainians died, no matter how badly the war was going. This is just sheer cynicism, and it's why they kept this secret. It's really why I think the Grayzone is so important. It's because we can allow the public to see what's being plotted outside of a democratic realm and outside the realm of international law. These are illegal terror operations that they're plotting. Craig, I don't know if you have any thoughts on, or if you read our investigation, if you had any thoughts on that, or on why the UK is so insistent on this war continuing almost forever.
Very, very hard to explain. I mean, it's very hard to get yourself into the mindset of these people. I'm sorry, I haven't actually read your investigation because it's come out since I've been here. I love your stuff, and I love Kit's stuff especially.
Thank you.
Kit's done some most amazing stuff, and his stuff on the Integrity Initiative was absolutely brilliant. And I should say that he and I cooperated a bit on some of that, which was good. Yeah, and when they talk of Gladio-style operations, we're talking of false flag terrorist operations, and that's really scary, and that's something I expect we will indeed see more of. And then you come, of course, to the whole question of the Maidan and what happened there, and to what extent that was false flag in Ukraine in the first place. It is about the military-industrial complex being an end in itself. Being these institutions take on their own institutional life, where the interest of the arms industry, the interest of the military, the interest of the security services defends itself. They become organic structures. Interested in promoting their own interest within the state. And that's often expressed as an abstract thought. But what you're seeing in those kind of documents and in the Integrity Initiative documents is that actually in action, how these institutions defend themselves and promote their interests against the actual interest and welfare of the rest of the people in the state that they belong to. And the idea of weakening Russia through bleeding it dry in the Ukraine is an idea which the British military are extremely fond of, because they then believe that may give them more freedom of action in other theatres, including the Middle East, where otherwise Russia might take a hand. And of course, they were greatly annoyed to be outmaneuvered bluntly by the Russians in Syria when they were trying to take over Syria. So part of what's happening in the Ukraine is actually a direct reaction to that successful assertion of Russian power overseas. They want to ensure that Russia does not have the ability to project forces anywhere else in order to stop their military operations anywhere else. But it's psychotic. I mean, it's so hard. It's so hard for normal people to understand this way of thinking. And again, we come again to what we're talking about: media complicity. I mean, German industry is in terrible trouble. The German economy is in terrible trouble, and huge household name manufacturers in Germany are shedding money, largely because of energy costs, or because of the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline.
Yep.
And I have read numerous articles in the mainstream media about the problems of the German economy, none of which mention the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline has anything to do with it, or the war in Ukraine has anything to do with it. And it's the same during the American election. There's a great deal of to and forth about the costs of the the causes of the great jump in inflation and the Ukraine war was a major cause, and
Yep.
nobody mentioned it. Nobody could say that. Just not in the debate. Just completely ruled out as a factor. Just not supposed to notice it's happening. There's nobody in the whole world who hasn't lost some. Well, that's not quite true. I guess if you're an armaments manufacturer, for example, you may have made money out of the Ukraine war, but everybody has suffered from rising costs due to the war in Ukraine, particularly rising costs of agricultural products and rising costs of energy. Major blips caused by the war in Ukraine, step changes in some agricultural costs, and yet you just never see it discussed. But it's not allowed to be part of the narrative.
It certainly wasn't here. I called it the NATO price hike when Biden attempted to reduce the ruble to rubble. And, these are boomerang sanctions. Ambassador Craig Murray has joined us live from Beirut. And where can our audience find more of your reporting from Beirut and from on all the issues that we've been discussing?
You can go to my website, which is Craig Murray, just my name, craigmurray.org.uk. And the UK is important, craigmurray.org.uk, because someone's put up a fake site at craigmurray.org without the UK in order to trick you and help you and prevent you finding my site. So craigmurray.org.uk. And I don't normally do this. In fact, I never do this, but I'm going to do it today because I have to, really, which is that we have come to Ukraine here with Niels Laderfoyd, the cinematographer, and we're producing so I've come to Ukraine. I've come to Lebanon with Niels Laderfoyd, the cinematographer, and we're producing a lot of content here on the war in Ukraine, but we do need funding to do it because we literally have none. We paid to get here out of our own pockets, and we only have what support we get from readers and viewers to help us do that. And I know that you support the Grayzone, which is a wonderful thing to do, and you should do it more. And I know that there are lots of other people asking for your funds, but just at the moment, we especially need money to help us to continue here in Lebanon. So if you could go to my website, craigmurray.org.uk, you can read plenty of stuff on all the things Max and I have been discussing. And if you can help us with funding, I'd be very, very grateful.
Yeah, definitely support everything Craig is doing. He is a powerhouse, and we rely on his work a lot at the Grayzone to inform our own perspective. So, Craig, thanks so much for joining us from there. You had some trouble getting your internet up to speed. So, we thank you for overcoming those barriers and speaking directly to our audience, which has, as I said, we're exceeding the audience levels of CNN when it's not on prime time and most MSNBC shows right now. And it's a real show of strength for independent media to have the support of this kind of audience. So like this stream, subscribe to the Grayzone. We've just broken 400,000 subscribers on YouTube, where we're heavily suppressed. We're about to reach 400,000 followers on Twitter. And it's thanks to you that we've been able to build this institution and give a platform to people like Craig. So thank you all for being part of another Grayzone stream. We'll be back next week with Aaron Mate and other guests. Peace, everybody, and stay safe out there, Craig.
Thank you. Bye.